Well, welcome back from fall break. Welcome back to Law Chapel. We are so thrilled to have you guys. We're excited to close out this semester. These last couple weeks really strong. We're happy to have you guys in here. We have a great speaker today, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. I do want to just give a couple quick announcements. First of all, next week we have a really special edition of Law Chapel. When I say that, it's because we've partnered with a great organization in our school called the Federalist Society. And the Federalist Society and Law Chapel are bringing here, for your benefit, Ryan Anderson, who's a great fellow at the Heritage Foundation. If you don't know who he is, I really strongly advise you to Google him and read some of the stuff he's written. He's an incredible social commentator, and he's written the first book-length response in response to the Obergefell decision from this summer, which is the subject he's going to be talking to us about, how Christians are going to respond. So I really encourage you, next week is not going to be a chapel to miss. I think this place is going to be pretty full because we're going to market this heavily. Ryan Anderson is someone we are extremely fortunate to have here. And that being said, like I said, it's a special edition of Law Chapel. So he's going to be given a little bit more time to speak. And then the event itself is going to carry over past 1 o'clock. Ryan will speak till about 12:50, and then we'll have he's gracious enough to give us time for question and answers till a little after 1. So there will still be lunch. So I'm going to make this announcement again next week before I introduce Ryan, but I'll give you guys a heads up now. We recognize that some students have afternoon commitments at 1 o'clock or a little after. So if you need to leave at the normal time for Law Chapel, which is 12:45, we just asked that at 12:45 next week, you just very quietly step out one of the side entrances. Lunch will be ready for you. Grab your lunch and then get to wherever you need to be. And if we ask if you don't have a commitment and you're inclined to stay, please stay. Brian's someone we're blessed to have with us, and I'm really excited to host him. So look forward to that next week. It's going to be a great time, and thanks to the Federalist Society for bringing him in for us. We're really excited. That being said, we have Dr. Martinez here today, so I'm going to ask Judge West to come up and introduce him and let the Center for Ethical Formation take it away. So thank you, Judge West.
It is really my great pleasure to be able to introduce you to Dr. Rob Martinez, a man that I've known for quite some time. His story is long and full, and he's going to go into more detail, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights. I have to give you some flavor of what to expect, to tease you a little bit. Very inspiring story. He came here at the age of 5 when his parents fled Cuba under the Castro regime in 1960. And they settled, I think, first in Boston and then in Brooklyn. And his father was an accountant, and he worked very hard. And then Dr. Martinez has proceeded to live the American dream. He graduated from Columbia University. He holds a PhD from Yale University. During the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, he served as the U.S. Department of Transportation as a deputy administrator for maritime administration, and was promoted by President George H.W. Bush to Associate Deputy Secretary of Transportation of the Office of Intermodalism. Dr. Martinez began working for Norfolk Southern in 1993, but left in 1994 to become the Secretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth of Virginia under Governor George Allen. As Secretary of Transportation, he had oversight over the Virginia Department of Transportation, VDOT, Department of Rail and Public Transportation, DMV, Aviation, Port Authority, all of those type of agencies. And that is where I met him. One of the highlights of my career was being in Governor George Allen's cabinet as well as Secretary of Public Safety. But the reason that was so much of a highlight was because of the people I got to work with and the people I got to know and got to meet. So I feel very fortunate for that experience. Dr. Martinez returned after the Allen administration in early 1998 to Norfolk Southern, where he now serves as Vice President of Business Development. I want to just tell you about one of many, many awards that he has received for the work that he's done in the community, because I think this and the quotes that are used in this article about him kind of describe it and just sum it all up. The Catholic Charities of Eastern Virginia and the Diocese of Richmond honored he and his wife, Dr. Christina Martinez, with their Humanitarian Award in 2013. And the head of that organization, the chief executive director, this is his quote: "This is a wonderful couple who do a lot of wonderful things for the community. I feel like they really live their faith every day." And that's what it's all about. Some people believe that faith is for Sundays and it's all business the rest of the week, if they even have faith at all. However, Dr. Martinez is living proof and that you can be an accomplished businessman, you can be a very successful person and live your faith every single day. And in fact, that is the way to do it. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to my friend, Dr. Rob Martinez.
That honestly was a little bit too much, but it was very nice. Thank you very much. As Judge West said, I am in fact a child of the Cuban Revolution. My family fled the country a year and a half following the takeover by Fidel Castro. I was not quite 5. In their enormous wisdom, my parents saw that, and they recognized before most, that what was coming was communism and an end to our freedom. We lived on a sugar plantation in the middle of nowhere, miles from Cienfuegos, which was the closest city. The plantation was called Central Soledad, which means solitude, and it very much was that. It had been owned by an American family who had been in Cuba for over 100 years. They were Mayflower people, and they still live outside of Boston, this family. By the time that the communists arrived to the plantation, the Americans were long gone, and my father was the highest-ranked Cuban that was left on the property. He was taken by the communists and detained overnight. In acknowledging the expropriation, when the plantation was stolen from its rightful owners, my dad told Fidel's goons that he was signing their documents acknowledging the expropriation only under duress. When we left Cuba, it was before Bay of Pigs, before the missile crisis, and the immense majority of Cubans, as did most Americans at that time, were still enthralled with Castro, Cuba's savior. Virtually all of my parents' friends turned against them as traitors to the revolution. We left everything behind. We traveled to the US under tourist visas, and we left with only 2 suitcases, as if we were going to be out for 2 weeks and then come back on a vacation. Anything of value, including treasured family photographs, were left behind out of concern that if we had been stopped on our way out, it would have been clear that we were not planning to return. When the visas expired, we traveled to Canada and solicited refugee status. Conditions in Cuba, by this time it's 1961, and conditions in Cuba had greatly deteriorated, and that request was granted immediately. In fairly short order, we ended up in Midtown Manhattan, which, as you can expect, is a little bit different than Central Soledad. Eventually, we moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, where my brother and I, along with a cousin who got out a little bit later, the 3 of us, we slept in the living room. We didn't own a car, nor a great many other things that we take for granted today. But really, and honestly, this is not a rags to riches story, because we were never really poor. We always had food on the table, lived in freedom, and we worshiped as we saw fit. And that's how we defined the richness in our lives. My parents did what they had to do, and they never looked back. Years later, new American friends would comment to my parents, "Oh, it must have been very difficult to leave everything behind." My dad would say, "Well, no, actually, it was very easy, because once we realized that what was coming was communism, the decision was very simple. We had to get out." The experience of the Cuban Revolution, in some respects, has defined my life. Prior to the revolution, my family had not been in any way political, but they had a profound love of freedom and a deep faith in God. Having gone through that struggle at home growing up, what was going on politically and socially became an ever-present topic of conversation at dinner, and we were always taught to speak the truth and not to fear the consequences. I can also say unequivocally that I have lived the American dream, and I'm living it right now. A couple of other things the Cuba experience taught me: that the vast majority of people can be wrong, and they can be wrong for a very long time. And that it's important to keep your wits about you, and in certain circumstances, you need to do in order to protect your family, as did my parents. It is perhaps not surprising that today, in my own home, John Paul II is very much a hero. In peace and in love, John Paul was a defender of freedom, a defender of culture, and a defender of life. Be not afraid. Be not afraid to live your faith. Be not afraid to speak the truth. I've been a student of the market for over 40 years. My doctoral work at Yale was on the political transition in Spain from Franco's authoritarianism to democracy from the perspective of business. How business was impacted by the transition and how business in turn influenced the course of democratization. I worked under Juan Linz, a most extraordinary Spaniard at Yale, who passed away recently, who was a scholar of Aristotelian breadth and also a man fully dedicated to his students. I am most definitely not an expert on Max Weber, but I was trained as a Weberian. Weber was a German sociologist of the early 20th century who understood the limitations of what could be known in the social sciences, but was committed to empirical research as a means to assess social reality, a predisposition much lacking in the America of today. So, during the early 80s, I was coming to appreciate the need for meticulous, often tedious, delving into real data as a means of understanding social reality, and the study of well-articulated public policy and well-crafted law as the channel for good social and economic outcomes. In sharp contrast, during the same period at Yale, visiting scholar, French philosopher Jacques Derrida, the architect of deconstruction, became all the rage among aspiring young intellectuals, professors, and other thought leaders. In deconstruction, language never actually means what it appears to mean. Even during my years at Yale, I realized how corrosive such an approach would be to the transmission of knowledge. Only in more recent years have I come to see how diffuse and how insidious this attitude has become, and how utterly destructive it is to societal cohesion, civic institutions, the rule of law, and in fact, truth itself. I believe in free markets, free enterprise, free peoples, freedom of speech, personal liberty, and religious freedom. I believe in free markets because as a means of production, they are the most efficient in allocating resources, maximizing the number of decision makers, and thereby creating the most good for the most people. And as such, I believe in markets not only from a purely economic basis, but also from a moral position as well. The explosive growth of the regulatory administrative state, combined with disincentives to self-improvement and social mobility, are changing the vigor of American society. We are living off invested capital, and combined with a movement away from a civic understanding based on Judeo-Christian conceptions of virtue, this trajectory is unsustainable. On November 9th of last year, we invited some friends over to our home, flew the German flag alongside Old Glory. We ate bratwurst and sauerkraut, drank Pilsner and Riesling. Now, why all these peculiarities in a Hispanic home? We celebrated the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a singular event in our lives, a testament to the victory of personal liberty, determination, and of truth over falsehood. It reflected the perseverance of Americans and other people who were lovers of freedom to parse the forest from the trees, to remain focused on a long-term goal at the heart of who we are as Americans. I worked for the first George Bush, Papa Bush, I call him, at the U.S. Department of Transportation. When he lost re-election in '92, and I know that sounds like a biblical reference to some of you, I knew I would be out of work in mid-January. I sent out a slew of resumes, and I was very fortunate in being hired by Norfolk Southern. A year later, George Allen was elected governor in Virginia. The evening of his election, I thought, for about 10 seconds, perhaps I should see if I could serve as the Secretary of Transportation. But I thought, I've never met him, I didn't do anything for the campaign, and I didn't give him a single penny of contribution, that's true. So I put the idea out of my mind. I never even mentioned it to Christina, my wife. A month later, early December '93, I'm in Miami on a business trip. It's late on a Wednesday evening, and I'm in my hotel room. This is before cell phones, okay? The phone rings, and it's a lady with the governor-elect's office. She has seen a copy of my resume from a year earlier. Would I be interested in interviewing for the position of Secretary of Transportation? I said, sure, I'd be honored. Well, when are you in Virginia? I said, I'll be back on Friday. Can you come in? I said, love to. Without advising my boss, I took a very early lunch hour that day, about 10 o'clock in the morning, in Norfolk, and I drove to Richmond. And so George Allen, the governor-elect, he receives me in the transition office. He asked me a first question during the interview. And the question is, I'm with Norfolk Southern. We're a railroad. Our arch competitor, you could say our arch enemy, is CSX. At that time, they were still headquartered in Richmond. So George Allen asked me a question. And the question, in the formulation of the question, it is a criticism of why CSX does not do something related to the Port of Virginia that Norfolk Southern does do, which the governor-elect saw as more beneficial to Virginia. But in the way that he formulated his question, for a split second, I thought, hey, that's pretty good. We got a new governor. He doesn't like CSX. But the way that he formulated the criticism of CSX was unfair towards CSX. If you're a railroader, you understand certain dynamics of networks and how we operate and why a railroad has to do certain things a certain way. So I realized that his criticism was really not a fair criticism of our arch enemy. So before I answered the question, I corrected him. I said, Governor, it's really not like that. And then I explained why CSX did what they did. Well, he proceeded to ask me 3 more questions, not about CSX, but about highways, about rail, transit rail. 3 other questions in which each time he asked me a question, the formulation was wrong in the basis of the question. And so for 4 times straight, before answering a question, I would have to reformulate the question, in effect telling him that he was incorrect. So I thought, well, this isn't going too well. Every time George Allen asked me a question, I start by correcting him. But after 4 such questions, suddenly the mood brightens, and it's like we're best buddies from ever before. That evening, I told Christina, I said, I think he's going to offer me the job. And on Monday, George Allen called. What's the moral of the story? George Allen didn't want a yes man or a yes woman working on his cabinet. I suspect that he knew that his questions were a bit off the mark, and he wanted to ascertain whether or not I would just go with the flow and guarantee a smooth conversation, or in fact, correct him. I can completely assure you, correcting a governor who I've never met before was a great deal more difficult than to have crafted a good enough response to get through. If getting through is what you're looking to do in life, you'll probably achieve it. But will you have succeeded in integrating your ethical dimension with your professional life? That's less certain. I will add that the woman on George Allen's staff who had first called me and who managed the interview arrangement was Ann Kincaid. She was a most wonderful, focused woman of God, a devoted evangelical. God called her home early a few years ago because he loved her so much. Ann conducted her own impromptu interview that day when I came out of the office with George Allen. She asked me how I plan to address congestion on Virginia's highway, about federal maritime policy, and how we might improve general aviation. Oh, and by the way, what's your position on abortion? Now, the conventional answer probably would have been a non-answer, something like, well, what does that have to do with being Secretary of Transportation? Or some nonsense about, being personally opposed. You've heard that one. Instead, I actually answered the question. At Norfolk Southern, speaking the truth means respectfully disagreeing, including with my CEO, if I believe that the course being suggested runs counter to the best interest of our company, its shareholders, its communities, customers, or the employees. Regrettably, even in a corporate setting, highly paid people generally play it safe. They remain silent. Does that reflect an ethical integration of one's principles with one's professional life? The approach that works for me, I start by asking my CEO, is it okay to offer a different point of view? So what's he going to say? No? Will answering truthfully always work out for the best? It has worked out for me. It may not always work out in the short run, but in the long run, it will always work out for the best. Remember, life is short, but eternity is forever. I travel a great deal for business, for NS, domestically and overseas. I chase projects. What does that mean? That means that if we learn that BMW, Hyundai, or Subaru is going to build another automotive plant in North America, I want them to build it next to Norfolk Southern, because then we serve them for 50 years. Or if Nippon Steel wants to build another steel mill, same thing. Build it where we can reach you with our railroad. So I travel, often with other colleagues. When you're in Brazil for a week at a time and in a different city every single night with the same colleague, flight after flight, even without intruding on their privacy, you learn a lot about them. And by who you are, how you act, you have an opportunity to evangelize. There's no reason not to attend church when you're traveling. If I'm overseas on a Sunday, I will not miss Mass. I like to attend daily Mass too when I can, and particularly in the age of the internet, it is not too demanding to figure out what your options are when you're away from home. Over the years, my colleagues have come to know that I'm good with them if they want to go to church with me. I have found you can evangelize without whacking over the head. Now, that's not to criticize people that are a little bit more aggressive than I am. But in a corporate setting, colleagues and even some customers come to know where you stand and that the door is open. When I'm on the road, sometimes all you need to do is invite them. We're meeting for dinner at 7. Okay, I'll say, I may be running just a few minutes late because there's a Mass at 6 o'clock that I'd like to attend. You'd be so surprised how many times people will say, oh, you're going to go to church? Can I go with you? About 4 years ago, I was in Italy on a business trip with Fiat, always chasing that next project. Fiat, as most of you know, they're the owners of Chrysler now. I learned a couple of weeks prior to my travel that the Shroud of Turin, the burial shroud of Christ our Lord, was going to be exposed for viewing. It was only like the 12th or 13th time in the past 500 years that it's been actually taken out of where it's stored. Our meeting that day was at 9 a.m. The cathedral would open at 7. You needed a ticket. It was free, but you needed to have a ticket stamped within a allotted time. That's how they were going to manage the crowd. 4 colleagues would be with me. Another Catholic, an Episcopal, a Lutheran, and a Jew. I didn't have to ask them if they wanted to come with me. All I said was, hey, I'm going to get myself a ticket to go see the shroud. What was the response? Hey, can I go with you? All 4 of them. Within 10 minutes through the website of the cathedral, I had the tickets in hand. So in the middle of a business trip at 7 o'clock in the morning, we spent 20 minutes contemplating the overwhelming immensity of God's great love for us. It was very emotional for me. Had I any doubt about the authenticity of the shroud prior to seeing it, I'll tell you, they were wiped away. The Lord said, go outside, stand on the mountain before the Lord will be passing by. A strong and heavy wind was rending the mountains, crushing rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, there was a tiny whispering sound. When he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak. We are made in the image and likeness of God. I look about this room, and I see a room filled with the spark of divine fire that resides in each one of us. We are, all of us, called to holiness. There are a few like Albert Schweitzer or Teresa of Calcutta who reflected heroic virtue. Most of us are called to a more mundane level of holiness, of holy accomplishment. But the good Lord wants us all to strive for holiness. Sister Faustina wrote that a soul's greatness consists not in great deeds, but in great love. Love has its worth, and it confers greatness on all of our deeds. Although our actions are small and ordinary in themselves, because of love, they become great and powerful before God. We need to strive for holiness where we are, whether that's the corporate boardroom, the judge's chamber, or the classroom. The call to holiness, I believe, is to find God in the ordinary, not in the extraordinary. It is in the ordinary of everyday life and everyday challenge where we need to seek Christ, not in the extraordinary events that move the world, but the ordinary events that move your brother, your child, your sister, the word of encouragement you offer, or the availability, openness to a colleague who may see things with less clarity. If you can seek God in the ordinary, sanctity is within reach of all of us. Work can be a means of sanctification. On listening to a beautiful operatic aria or a mass by Bach, well sung, or contemplating Velázquez or Murillo, it may be very easy to be inspired to recognize God's graces. His love in using individuals with extraordinary talents to introduce us to beauty. But I have come to realize the beauty of God in my colleagues when they are able to create a superb brief on some challenge that's facing Norfolk Southern and capably communicate that to others when it's a difficult assignment and we need to correct action. If its intended purpose is good, to improve our service to customers, helping them move forward, at the same time improving our own company, which provides employment to 30,000 people, this is a good thing. Look at your colleagues in that light as provided talents by God to do good in their work. If you have not done that in the past, it gives you a different insight into God's goodness. When it comes to holiness, I like evangelist Matthew Kelly's approach. He contends that we are each called to be the best version of ourselves that we can be. I know I cannot be Mother Teresa, but I know what the best version of me is like. And I believe if I set my mind to that, I can achieve that. In Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth, John Paul teaches that within each soul there exists the reflection of truths that are universally, intrinsically known. Psalm 4 reads that the light of natural reason by which we discern good from evil is nothing less but an imprint on us of the divine light. Aquinas taught that God gave us this light to man at creation so that we might understand what must be done and what must be avoided. In Romans 1, Paul writes that, quote, ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what he has made. Those who would suppress truth have no excuse. While claiming to be wise, they become fools and exchange the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of man, the likeness of an image of mortal man. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and revered and worshipped the creature rather than the creator, unquote. The founding fathers of our country understood this natural law as pre-existing and as the proper basis on which to structure civil society. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Once the idea of a universal truth about the good knowable by human reason is lost, individuals assume the prerogatives of independently determining the criteria of good and evil. When each person defines his own truth different from the truths of others, and that individual citizens can hold particular values which need not be shared in common, the fabric of society comes apart. Individuals in civil power never have the authority to violate the fundamental and inalienable rights of the human person. In the end, only a morality which acknowledges certain norms as valid always and for everyone, with no exception, can guarantee the ethical foundation of social coexistence. Our nation was built on shared values. Those values include the rule of law and not of men, equality before the law, respect for the dignity of every human life, rule by the majority, but respect for the minority, religious liberty, and the right for the person of faith to defend her views in the public square, open and without social constraints. Paul encouraged Timothy to, quote, preach the word, be urgent in season and out of season, convince, rebuke, and exhort. Be unfailing in patience and in teaching. For the time will come when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own likings and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander into myths, unquote. So, the time will come when people will turn away from truth and wander into myths. Are we there yet? Ideas matter and they have consequences. Words have meaning. Again, John Paul in Veritatis Splendor. We are living in a crisis of truth in which each individual affirms his own moral judgment as true simply as a result of having deemed it thus for himself. Conscience is no longer considered in its primordial reality as an act of a person's intelligence, the function of which is to apply universal knowledge of the good in a specific situation, and thus to express a judgment about the right conduct. Instead, we grant the individual conscience the prerogative of independently determining the criteria of good and evil, unquote. Even those favoring creative interpretations instead of the clear meaning of words must realize that absent limits, our system of government and the defense of true freedom are destined for disintegration. Once words have lost their clear meaning, on what basis will fair judgments be made? Our culture has transformed the conception of conscience into a subjective determination of one's own will and unrelated to objective truth. Sound economics, as well as sound law, not to say moral rectitude, demands that we recover the basis of our country's foundation. We live in an age of profound confusion. Dare to be countercultural. Today, conventional wisdom holds that there exists no absolute truth. I suspect that we here at a place like Regent know better. Recognize that increasingly it is largely people of faith who appear willing and are sufficiently grounded in real freedom to speak in counter to the coercion of the militant, intolerant secularism. The family is under siege, and public institutions seek to have people of faith cower in silence. In recognition of God's infinite love for all men and women, and in humility as we struggle how best to understand His will, we each should endeavor to keep the faith, defend human life, especially the defenseless and the poor, strengthen the family, and realize that you must start from where you find yourself today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martinez, for that powerful, inspiring message, very thoughtful. And I was encouraged by the notion of being the best that we can be in our lives. And we do live, I agree, we do live in an age of confusion, and how much we are called to be fearless, as Paul also writes, fearless in our defense of truth and defense of the gospel. So thanks very much for that powerful message and powerful testimony to how you parents immigrated and the amazing story that you have. So I wanted to also say a few things before we have our lunch. So today is sponsored by the Center for Ethical Formation. And some of you may kind of wonder a little bit what we do. We know you know that we have the mentor program, but let me tell you quickly before I pray and we go to lunch a little bit about the center. What are we about? Why are we here? Well, several years ago, some studies came out that said that law schools are doing a good job of helping students develop the skills to think like a lawyer, right? Analytical skills, problem-solving skills. We're working at helping students to develop the skills of the practical skills that are important for the practice of law, writing, negotiation, those kinds of things. We have work to do in that area, but we're working on it. But the report said that law schools are doing a very poor job throughout the country of helping students to develop a professional identity. That if you look around the profession, unfortunately, there are so many in our profession that are struggling. Some with very direct issues with depression, alcohol abuse, some just unhappy, not being fulfilled in the practice. And as law schools, unfortunately, we're playing a role in that. And how can we do a better job? Now, at Regent, of course, this is something that we've been passionate about for years. So when we read those reports, we were concerned, but say, how can we as an institution be a voice, a better voice here on campus, but even more, a better voice in our local community, and I say even more, a better voice nationally and internationally to promote professionalism and integrity and character in the legal profession. So a few years ago, Dee Madison and I had a vision to start the center, and we've been very pleased with what we've been able to do all through just the support of the school, but ultimately it all comes back to support and blessings from the Lord. So Some of you know the mentor program that we do, but we also do writing and scholarship and events and build relationships like with Dr. Martinez, a non-lawyer, which is good, right? It's good to hear from non-lawyers sometimes that have a profound message for us this afternoon. So Chris Pacta and Diane Hess-Hernandez are two students that work with us. I want to invite you, if you're interested in helping us programmatically or just helping us with research, please come see me. Please come see Dean Madison. And let us know. We'd love to partner with you in this collective enterprise. So without further ado, I'll dismiss you for lunch. I'm going to pray for our time. We have black tables and there are white tables. There's another event happening in the atrium there. So stay off the white tables if you can, because there's another event. I was directed to encourage you to do that. But again, thank you, Dr. Martinez, for your message. And let me dismiss us with a word of prayer. Father God, we do praise you, Lord, and we thank you. We thank you that, Lord, you love us and that you have demonstrated that, Father God, in so many ways, Lord. We think about the sacrifice of your Son. We think about the daily ways that you remind us of your love for us. I thank you for Rob Martinez, for the story, for the testimony that you built in his life, some of which we heard this afternoon. I thank you for his witness. I thank you that, Lord, you call us to be people of integrity, not just to have church on Sunday, but to live it throughout the week. Lord, help us to know what that means on a daily basis. Help us to be fearless and bold, to not just do only big things, but small things, Lord, to invite people into a relationship with you. We thank you for this food. We ask you to bless it to our nourishment. And I thank you for Regent Law School and Regent University. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.